Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you from Founders Fund, John COOGAN.
Thank you. What? Perfect. Thank you, everyone. I'm John COOGAN. I work at a venture capital firm, Founders Fund, in Silicon Valley. And for the past year, I've been making documentaries about business, technology, geopolitics, and I've made a lot about defense technology. So today, I have been fascinated by the rise, fall, and rise again of defense technology. And so this talk is really an attempt to tell a cohesive story of the history of defense technology. And I believe that the story should start in 1940. So Adolf Hitler really shaped both the history of defense technology and Silicon Valley. He essentially created Silicon Valley by bombing the United Kingdom. In 1940, he was leading the Blitz, and the Germans were bombing Britain. And there was something called the Cam-Hubert line, which was a series of radars that would detect Allied bombing raids, and it was absolutely devastating. They had a plane called the Messerschmitt 262, which was the first jet-powered fighter craft that was decimating our bombers. And it became a real cat and mouse game where the Allies would come up with a radar system, the Germans would come up with a counter-radar system, and we went back and forth for years. And so the solution was this man named Vannevar Bush, who you might have seen in Oppenheimer. Anybody see Oppenheimer this year? He was played by Matthew Modine, and he is a science legend. And his idea was basically to combine civilian scientists with the military government personnel. And so he had this idea of bringing these scientists and the government together. He puts together this one-page memo. Jeff Bezos would have been very proud of him. Brings it to FDR, and FDR loves it and approves it in 10 minutes. And so that creates the National Defense Research Committee in 1940, and their job is jointly to develop the nuclear bomb and then also radar. And so in 41, Bush goes on to create the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and then in 42, he founds the Harvard Radio Research Lab, which was really the key focus to develop new radar and anti-radar technologies. And in order to run the Harvard Radio Research Lab, he taps a student who he was the thesis advisor for, Fred Terman. And this guy really is the unsung hero of Silicon Valley. He's the reason why Silicon Valley exists in Silicon Valley specifically. And we'll get into why exactly that happened. But so he runs the Harvard Radio Research Lab, and while they're building radar for the war effort, they wind up building 150 different anti-radar devices. They invent chaff, which is aluminum foil, set to half the wavelength of the radar that it's trying to disrupt. They create carpet jammers and also bombing radar that helps the Allies succeed in Operation Gomorrah, one of the most successful bombing raids in 1943. But after the war ends, Fred Terman needs something new to do because he's kind of out of a job. And so he goes back to Stanford, moves to Silicon Valley, and brings this ethos of incredible technologists and science experts working with the government to Stanford, and creates the Stanford Industrial Park. He's the Dean of School of Engineering, and out of that come some of the most legendary companies in Silicon Valley. Two of his students were talking to him, hey, we got this idea for a tech startup. It turns out it's Hewlett-Packard. And out of there also came Varian Associates, General Electric, Lockheed Martin, like tons of interesting companies. And this is all like pre-transistor. So the story here is like the first 3 decades after World War II were phenomenal for the development of defense technology. The 1950s, the Cold War is heating up, and there's this big oh shit moment in 1957 when the Russians launched Sputnik. And so Sputnik has almost been forgotten to the sands of time now, but it was an insane moment in American history. The New York Times published 279 articles about Sputnik in a single month. It was like 11 a day. And so even though the Soviet Union had taken massive casualties in World War II, they were super strong in tech, had a bunch of really intelligent scientists, and were able to develop incredible rocket technology. And so the CIA actually knew that Sputnik was going to happen, but they couldn't tell the American people that they knew because that would give away all their spying secrets. So everyone in the United States was terrified. Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time, said, "The people of the United States have been humiliated. They're disturbed and they're unhappy." Very, very aggressive language. So the US needed to respond, and they wound up responding with the Vanguard TV3, launched just 2 months later, but that actually blew up shortly after leaving the pad. And then they were successful with the Explorer 1 in 1958, which was a smaller satellite, but it went deeper into space. And so it was, we were on top again. And the space race was fully underway. And so out of these efforts to create different rockets that could compete with Sputnik, there were a whole bunch of different projects, and they needed to be consolidated. So the US Secretary of Defense at the time, Neil McElroy, meets with Ernest Lawrence, another guy who you've probably seen in Oppenheimer, and they decided to form a new group. So they go to President Eisenhower, and in 1958, he approves the plan for DARPA. And DARPA obviously has an incredible, deep storied history that we could go into, but they've had some incredible wins in defense technology and just technology broadly. I mean, they basically invented the internet, stealth aircraft, GPS, drones, and also the self-driving cars that are going around San Francisco now. All of that came out of the DARPA Grand Challenge in 2003, I think. And so the 60s were another amazing decade for defense technology and the United States government working alongside independent companies and independent scientists. And just to put it into perspective, in the 60s, the Department of Defense was 36% of all research and development spending, and that's not in the United States, that's actually in the world. And so we were crushing it, obviously, but the Harvard Radio Research Lab and DARPA were both very government-driven. Skunk Works marked a shift, and at the heart of Skunk Works was a very, very important individual, Kelly Johnson. And a theme that we'll see is that throughout this talk is that when defense tech is working effectively, there are really, really driven individuals at the heart of every single project. And Kelly Johnson is that. Fred Terman was that at the Harvard Radio Research Lab. Obviously, Vannevar Bush was the same thing. Ernest Lawrence, very similar. And so Kelly Johnson was designing planes at age 12. And at age 23, he goes to work at Lockheed Martin as a tool designer. And he's incredibly confident for a 23-year-old. They're building a plane, and Lockheed has kind of bet the farm on this plane. And he goes to the chief design engineer and says, like, this plane is fucked, like, it's not gonna work, you've made a terrible mistake. And so the chief design engineer is like, hey, hotshot, like, if you think you're so smart, like, why don't you go and fix it? And so he does. He goes to this wind tunnel, tests like 1,000 different designs, and actually winds up fixing it. And he has a huge run of these like massive successes. Like I mentioned earlier, the Messerschmitt 262, that jet-powered plane that was destroying our bombers. He kind of created the Hudson bomber, which was like our response to that. And then so that was like his story in World War II. And then during the Cold War, the CIA needed a spy plane. This becomes the U-2. Lockheed actually wasn't invited to submit for the proposal, so he goes and gets money from the CIA. And there's this maybe apocryphal story about Kelly Johnson going to a cafe in Georgetown and getting handed a bunch of money under the table in a brown paper bag. And who knows if it's true, but they got the money and they built the plane, and it just speaks to the importance of this individual driving force and staying out of this quagmire committees that have obviously cropped up. The development of these early 60s planes just looks so much different from the way we do things today with the F-35, for example. And so just 4 months after receiving the contract, Kelly Johnson wrote something in his diary that I think is just incredible. It says, "Airplane essentially completed, terrifically long hours, everybody almost dead." And it's just like the drive that this guy had to just be a leader, get everyone on the same page, and do whatever it took to just build this plane, because he was obsessed with these planes. They wound up testing the U-2 at Area 51, fun fact. And the U-2 was a great plane, but it wasn't fast enough. And so the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, got shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, and they needed something faster, so they had to go supersonic. And so Skunk Works built SR-71. Over 2,000 miles an hour, incredible plane, and it can outrun missiles. The speed of the plane is impressive, but I think what's much more impressive is the speed of the engineering and the speed of the business, the economics that had to come together to make this plane happen. And it's funny, I was reviewing these slides with my wife last night, and she's like, oh, you're in the 1960s, like you should make it clear that you're like skipping forward in time. And I was like, what are you talking about? She's like, that plane's clearly not from the 60s. And I'm like, no, that plane actually flew in the 60s. Like, we used to be able to build stuff like this. This is crazy. So, I don't know, it's just funny. The moon landing happens in 1969, and this is really, I think, like the crescendo of defense tech working really, really effectively. And the next 3 decades are marked by pretty severe setbacks. And so in the 70s, American defense technology was amazing. And to be clear, like we did a lot of cool things in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but this was really where all of the problems started to crop up that we're now solving for. And so when you talk to people in defense tech, they often highlight like a single pivotal point of failure. I think that the reasons for the failures of recent defense technology are very multifaceted, and I don't think that there's just one. So we're going to go through 3. So in the 70s, America changed very significantly, and there's tons of evidence of this. This is really the beginning of technological stagnation, and you can see that in the disconnect between worker productivity and hourly compensation. These trend lines were growing perfectly with each other, and then you can just see that there's a massive split. I think I have a laser pointer, yeah. Massive split in 1971, and the reason, and you see this with energy too, we were on an exponential curve going up to the 70s, and then we just stopped. Obviously, this was supposed to be nuclear, but we just never made it happen. And so the 70s were this point where stagnation started to set in, and of course, we didn't feel all of those effects immediately, but it started to have a very severe effect on defense technology and just technology broadly. We shifted to a world of software instead of hardware. And so there's 3 kind of places that you can see stagnation set in outside of the data. I think of it as like long lines at the doctor's office because our medicine isn't advancing, long lines at the airport because we have TSA and we're moving slower and our planes are not going faster. They should be going supersonic and they're not. And then long lines at the gas pump because we don't have nuclear energy. We rejected the atom. And everyone has a different reason for why this happened. Like if you talk to a Bitcoin guy, he'll tell you, oh, it's because we didn't do the gold standard, like we should be on the gold standard. Maybe that's true. If you talk to libertarian, they'll tell you it's all over-regulation. It costs over $1 billion to approve a new drug with the FDA. And so maybe we have too much regulation. You can't build in the real world anymore, so people have turned to the virtual world. And I think there's also just a major economic factor here. So you have the economics of the gold standard, the political of the over-regulation, and then also just the technology factor of bits, like the idea of building software, that moves faster than atoms. And so if you're Bill Gates starting Microsoft in 1975, you don't have people from the government checking your code, checking how safe it is, how dangerous it is. You can just build. And so that's very attractive to the most hardworking genius engineers. They want to go and accelerate. They want to build incredible technologies. And if you give them a lot of these technologists, they could have gone and built nuclear power plants, so they could have gone and built defense technology companies, but they leaned into the internet because that's where it was easier. And so the 70s are really the era of the beginning of technological stagnation. Now with the 80s, we need to talk about globalization because that was another major factor in the decline of defense technology. And so you could maybe flag the beginning of globalization in 1971 when Henry Kissinger goes to China. I think the 80s are important to highlight because it's really when manufacturing jobs in America peaked, right in 1979. This was the peak, and it's just been downhill ever since. And there are, again, a bunch of reasons why, not just one. So US manufacturing employment peaked in June of 1979 at 22% of total non-farm employment. By 2019, that had dropped to 9%. So let's talk about why. So again, I think there's three reasons: economics, politics, and technology. So on the economic side, you have cheaper labor. You have, obviously, there's a desire to outsource, go to China. There's trade agreements that make it easier for companies to become multinationals. And then there's also technology. Like, we built container ships, and this makes globalization easier. And again, this was only rational. Everyone was just making rational economic decisions, but it got us into a very, very problematic place. So the China situation has gotten particularly fraught because of what I call the China fade strategy. There's this quote or story that a lot of entrepreneurs like to talk after they've done business in China for a few years, which is something that they like to call the danger of the 50-50 partnership, which is where the American company loses 50% of their money in the first year and 50% of their money in the second year. And the way this happens is something that people like to call quality fade, which is that if let's say you're, I don't know, manufacturing this podium and you go to China, they will undercut the competition and try and give you the cheapest possible quote. And it's almost too good to be true because it is. And then over time, they will keep your price flat, but they will reduce the quality of the product that they're producing. So using cheaper ingredients, this is where we get carcinogenic materials, all sorts of different problematic ingredients. I've even heard about scenarios where they'll go and the Chinese manufacturer will create a new mold that has slightly thinner walls just to save on the cost of goods. It gets really crazy. But that doesn't apply for every company because some companies have quality assurance programs and can measure the width of this plastic and make sure that that's not happening. And then that turns into what I've called morality fade, which is where instead of reducing the quality of the product, you're reducing the morality of the situation that led to the production of the goods. So that's things like using child labor or Uyghur slaves, these types of things. And so we've gotten ourselves into a very, very difficult situation globally. And then in the 90s, this is the moment that everyone in defense tech points to with the Last Supper. So the end of the Cold War, this is 1991. And there was a desire for a peace dividend. We no longer had great power competition. And this was a bipartisan issue. Even Dick Cheney said, because we now face neither a global threat nor a hostile, non-democratic power dominating a region critical to our interests, we have the opportunity to meet our requirements at lower levels and at lower cost. And the source of this problem really goes back to Robert McNamara, who instituted the planning, programming, and budgeting system where funding would be allocated based on strategic objectives set by the DoD's military and civilian leadership. And so basically the exact opposite of Kelly Johnson going and building a plane with the $30 million from the CIA handed to him under the table. And so between 1991 and 1996, defense spending fell by more than 15%. And the Last Supper was really a key turning point where all of this consolidation sets in. This is a graph from Anderol that's been horribly stretched out, I'm sorry, but it's a widescreen presentation, so had to do it. Basically, the Pentagon had commissioned a study and said that basically the US didn't need as many defense contractors as they had. There used to be 50 defense primes on the left, you can see, and we wound up with 5. And so the Secretary of Defense, Leslie Aspin, and his deputy, William Perry, brought everyone together in the fall of 1993, and they were very clear. They said, we expect defense companies to go out of business. They wanted to encourage mergers, cut costs, and there were just dozens of mergers. Hughes Electronics and McDonnell Douglas ceased to exist. General Electric and Chrysler sold their defense subsidiaries. At one point, the industry was shedding 1,000 jobs a day. And this didn't matter because everyone had bought into the idea that Francis Fukuyama had presented, that we were at the end of history, that liberal economics would ensure a peaceful order in the world forever. But obviously that wasn't true. And so the 2000s brings us to the war on terror. 9/11 was obviously a massive wake-up call. There were new problems and it required new solutions. This wouldn't completely shake up defense tech, but it was the start. And it was a shift to much more independent defense technology development. Essentially, just people in Silicon Valley doing things that the government hadn't even asked them for. And Palantir is the key case study here. Really marks the return of ambitious, determined individuals. Alex Karp, the founder and CEO, is this crazy philosopher king who has built this incredible engineering core and would just go and get stuff done as fast as possible, and then kind of, ask for forgiveness later. And the government had actually tried to build what was essentially Palantir twice. Once, Admiral John Poindexter tried to solve the problem with something called total information awareness, but it was seen as very dystopian, and people were worried about government spying, and so that project didn't get off the ground, but Admiral John Poindexter was able to meet with Peter Thiel and Alex Karp and kind of inform the strategy for Palantir going forward. And they basically, after 9/11, the government acknowledged that they needed a Manhattan Project for counterterrorism, but it never materialized because total information awareness failed. And so Palantir was really lucky in that it was a way to apply the software chops that we developed in Silicon Valley to this defense tech problem that we had. And so the story of Palantir, it's a data analysis software, but the background of the founding team is from PayPal, and PayPal had a fraud issue where people were going on PayPal and exploiting the system to steal money, and so they had built a whole bunch of technology to sift through all the data on PayPal and find the needles in the haystacks, find the criminals, and then report them to the FBI. And they said, why can't we use this for counterterrorism? And they did, and this was really the beginning of the shift in Silicon Valley back to defense, and marked a really, really key turning point. And it was tough to get funding for Palantir in the early days. Peter Thiel put in, I think, like $30 million of his own money. And Palantir was actually laughed out of one of the biggest Silicon Valley firms who's now investing in defense tech, fortunately. But there were tons and tons of setbacks. But fortunately, In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm, stepped up and gave them some funding. They were the first programmed money into Palantir, and also Anduril, actually. And interestingly, In-Q-Tel was founded before 9/11. George Tenet had some foresight there and founded in 2000 and set up this interesting arrangement called the In-Q-Tel Work Program, where the government gave In-Q-Tel some money. In-Q-Tel would buy or license technology from Silicon Valley companies and then get warrants in exchange that they could then later cash for equity in the companies. And they've built this portfolio, and whenever they are able to exit a position and sell their stake in the company, that funds their operations. So it's this kind of beautiful cycle that doesn't cost the taxpayer anything and helps accelerate defense technology. And so, yeah, Alex Karp is just like that Kelly Johnson mold. He just gets it done. And he was completely unqualified to do any of this, by the way. He had no military experience, nothing. He was like a philosopher. But Palantir did face a massive uphill struggle. They wound up having to sue the government because the Army had created something called the Distributed Common Ground System, which was kind of like their version of Palantir. They'd been building it in-house, and they didn't want to switch to Palantir, which was kind of this off-the-shelf software that they could just buy. And even though 96% of military personnel deemed Palantir's software to be effective, the Army had still rejected it. And so the lawsuit took years, but Palantir won, and it was a big moment for defense tech because it showed that if you just built if you just actually went and solved the problem, you could fight through all the problems of the funding environment, get money wherever it would come to you, and you could actually fight and win in the court and build a really big business, as they have. So the 2010s, I think, are really focused on the space race 2.0, and of course SpaceX is at the center of that story. And there were tons of early failures with SpaceX. We now think of the company as like a runaway success, but there were tons of moments where Elon lost all his money and needed to beg people and get a bunch of last-minute funding for things. Tons of explosions, but in the 2010s, SpaceX really started to work. And so They'd failed to deliver a rocket to orbit 3 times, but then they finally got a NASA contract in 2008 and started knocking down milestones. And so in 2010, the first Falcon 9 flight, 2012, the first commercial ISS resupply, 2015, the first orbital rocket landing, 2016, the first drone ship landing, 2020, the first crewed flight to the ISS. And SpaceX also had to sue the government, and fun fact, they actually used the same lawyer as Palantir. And they won. And so just this idea that if you're this, I mean, Elon Musk is like the most extreme example of these like crazy individual founders. But if you're just willing to just not take no for an answer, you can, like anything is possible, essentially. And so the Air Force opened up the competition, and now SpaceX has been doing very well. And there were a couple other key moments in the 2010s that really shaped what we think of as the defense tech community now. So in 2015, Ash Carter creates the Defense Innovation Unit. In 2016, Eric Schmidt is the inaugural chairman for the Defense Innovation Board. And then in 2017, Trace Stevens is thinking about founding Anduril, and he goes to the Founders Fund Limited Partners and says, hey, we have this clause in our LP agreement that says we can't invest in weapon technology. We need to change that. They change it, they raise the new fund, and the first investment out of that fund is Anduril. And that has kind of acted as a just something that every other venture capitalist can look towards and say, okay, well, you know, there's an established pattern for investing in weapons technologies, which of course was the norm back in early Silicon Valley, but somehow we lost that during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so in the 2020s, I mean, I think we all know the history here. Great power competition has returned. We're seeing major conflicts driven by China, Russia, and Iran. And fortunately, defense tech is cool again, and we're actually focused on these things, and the return of the individual, powerful, driven founder is leading the charge. I mean, Palmer Luckey is like a total meme, and everyone has so much respect for him, and he's able to marshal an incredible amount of resources to actually go and build really, really cool things. And so every VC fund is developing a strategy here and revising their fund limited partner agreements. And there's been a bunch of big wins, SpaceX, Anduril, Palantir, and people are able to look towards those and then build a strategy for their portfolio. So I'm extremely optimistic. But what makes me the most optimistic is just the return to a focus on founders and individuals driving innovation in the defense tech community. These are folks who have an incredible work ethic. We've seen that time and time again with all of those stories. And I'd like to close with a quote from Peter Thiel about this. The fate of our world may depend on the effort of a single person who builds or propagates the machinery of freedom that makes the world safe for capitalism. And so thanks for having me.
Thank you, John. Awesome work, man.
Thank you.